That inflatable ring is in violation of Section C, Paragraph 12 of the Community Pool Regulations, she declared. The voice was like nails on a chalkboard, amplified by the humid air of the pool enclosure. It must be removed immediately. I looked down at my 7-year-old granddaughter, whose face was already starting to crumple. She was floating serenely in the shallow end, her bright pink flamingo ring the only splash of vibrant color in a sea of beige tile and chemically blue water. Then I looked back at the woman who had materialized at the edge of the pool, arms crossed, her floral muumuu stretched taut over a frame built on indignation and cheap wine. This was Brenda, the self-appointed empress of our homeowners association. "Brenda?" I said, my voice intentionally low and calm. "It's a child's floaty, not a naval destroyer. She's not bothering anyone." "Rules are rules, Mr. Henderson," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "We maintain a certain standard here at the Willows. We can't have the pool deck cluttered with garish, non-compliant flotation devices. It lowers the tone." I glanced around. The pool was nearly empty on this Tuesday afternoon. Just myself, my granddaughter, and an elderly couple quietly reading under an umbrella 50 feet away. The only thing lowering the tone was her. "I'll be sure to keep it from cluttering the deck," I replied, my tone still even. I had spent 25 years in the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps. I'd negotiated with warlords in dusty, forgotten countries and stared down corporate lawyers in sterile boardrooms. A petty tyrant in a muumuu was not going to break my composure. This, however, was not the response she wanted. Her power was built on immediate, fearful compliance. My calm refusal was a crack in her foundation. Her face, already a mask of poorly applied foundation, began to flush a dull, angry red beneath the powder. "That's not the point, and you know it," she hissed, leaning closer. "Furthermore, I don't see your resident pool pass. All residents must have their pass visible at all times when using the facilities. It's in the bylaws you agreed to." "I don't have one," I said simply. A flicker of triumph lit her eyes. This was the opening she needed. "No pass, no pool. You and the child need to leave. Now. Your privileges are revoked until you can present a valid, board-issued pass." She had no idea. She saw a quiet retiree in a polo shirt and swim trunks, a man who kept to himself and maintained a tidy lawn. She didn't see the man who'd spent decades untangling Byzantine legal codes, a man whose entire career was built on understanding the structure of power and leveraging it. She thought she was enforcing a rule. What she was actually doing was declaring war, and she had just chosen a battlefield where I held every conceivable tactical advantage. This was her first and most fatal mistake. She thought this was about a pool pass. She was about to learn it was about everything. If you've ever dealt with a petty tyrant who thinks their tiny bit of authority makes them a king or queen, you're going to want to stick around for this. Hit that subscribe button, because the story of how this self-proclaimed empress lost her entire kingdom is one for the ages. That evening, after my granddaughter was asleep, her disappointment soothed by a promise of ice cream and a movie, I began my campaign. War isn't always fought with troops and tanks. Sometimes it's fought with paper. And I was about to build a fortress of it. My home office, usually a quiet sanctuary for reading history books, became a command center. I started with reconnaissance. The first document I retrieved from my files was the original deed to my property. My family had owned this land for 3 generations. I was the one who sold the surrounding acreage to the developer who built the Willows. I did so with several carefully drafted covenants and easements attached, provisions my JAG training had taught me were non-negotiable for protecting my own interests. I found the relevant passage within minutes. It was a utility easement, granting the development access to the deep water well located on my parcel. The well that my grandfather had drilled by hand. The well that supplied every single drop of water to the entire subdivision. The houses, the irrigation systems for the manicured lawns, the fire hydrants, and, of course, the community pool. The contract was ironclad. In exchange for providing the water, I was granted permanent, unrestricted access to all community amenities, present and future, exempt from any dues, fees, or procedural requirements levied by any future homeowners association. The developer had eagerly signed it to avoid the astronomical cost of running a municipal water line out this far. The HOA, as the developer's successor, was bound by it. Brenda hadn't revoked my privileges. She couldn't. She had simply violated a legally binding contract. This was good. This was the strategic high ground. But it wasn't enough. A direct assault was not my style. I preferred the siege. I wanted to dismantle her power base brick by brick, not just knock down the front gate. Her position as HOA president was the source of her authority. I needed to undermine that position until it crumbled into dust. The next morning, I drafted my first official communication. It was a formal request, sent via certified mail with return receipt requested to the HOA Board of Directors. I cited the state statute that guaranteed homeowners the right to inspect all association records. I requested copies of the past 5 years of meeting minutes, all financial statements including budgets and expense reports, and a complete record of all fines levied against residents. The certified letter was a calibrated move. It was a legal formality that signaled I was no longer operating on a casual, neighborly basis. It created a paper trail. Her response, or lack thereof, would be my next piece of evidence. While I waited for the legally mandated response time to elapse, I began Phase 2. Intelligence gathering and alliance building. I started taking walks around the neighborhood in the early evenings, not just for exercise, but for observation. I saw the small signs of Brenda's reign of terror. The perfectly manicured lawn of the Miller family, who I knew loved gardening, now barren of the colorful flowers Brenda had deemed unapproved flora. The empty driveway of the Chen family, where their son's basketball hoop used to be, now gone after a series of escalating fines for recreational nuisances. My first stop was the Millers. George and Eileen were in their late 70s, sweet people who had lived here for a decade. I found Eileen tending her small, board-approved boxwoods, her face a mask of quiet resignation. "Eileen," I started gently, "I wanted to ask you about your roses. You used to have the most beautiful garden on the block." Her eyes welled up. "Oh, hello, Colonel," she said, using my old title from habit. "Brenda made us rip them out. Said they didn't match the community aesthetic. We got 3 fines. We couldn't afford a 4th. "Did she cite the specific bylaw in the fine notice?" I asked. George came out onto the porch. "She just wrote landscaping violation. We asked to see the rule, and she said she was the president, and she didn't have to explain her decisions to us. She said if we fought it, she'd put a lien on our house." This was a critical piece of intelligence. The threat of a lien is the HOA tyrant's nuclear option. It's terrifying to elderly people on a fixed income. It was also, in this case, completely illegal without a proper hearing and appeals process. "Would you be willing to provide me with a copy of those notices?" I asked, "and a written statement of what happened?" George looked hesitant, his eyes darting around as if Brenda might materialize from the bushes. "I don't want any more trouble, Colonel." "The trouble is already here, George," I said, my voice firm but reassuring. "The only way to stop a bully is to stand up to them. But you don't have to stand alone." He looked at his wife, then back at me. He saw the resolve in my eyes. He nodded slowly. All right. I'll get them for you. One down. My next visit was to the Chens. They were a young couple with 2 kids. I explained my situation at the pool and then asked about their basketball hoop. She was a nightmare, Mr. Chen said, his voice tight with anger. She claimed it was an eyesore. Then she said the sound of our son dribbling the ball violated the noise ordinance. The one that starts at 10 p.m. He was playing at 4 in the afternoon. We got fined $200, Mrs. Chen added. Then she sent a letter saying if we didn't remove it, the next fine would be $500, and she'd bill us for the legal costs of enforcing it. Did you get that in writing? I asked. We did. I'd very much like a copy of it. They, too, were hesitant, but they were angry. Their fear was mixed with a simmering resentment that was closer to the surface than the miller's quiet despair. They agreed. I spent the next week repeating this process. I was methodical. I was discreet. I spoke to a dozen families. The stories formed a clear and damning pattern. Fines for leaving garbage cans out for 2 hours past the designated pickup time. Violations for holiday decorations that were the wrong shade of red. A warning sent to a family for their dog barking at a passing squirrel. In every case, Brenda was the sole arbiter. She issued vague notices, cited non-existent bylaws, and used threats of liens and legal fees to ensure compliance. She was running the HOA not as a community organization, but as a personal fiefdom. I compiled everything into a 3-inch binder. Each family had its own tab. Each tab contained copies of the violation notices, canceled checks for paid fines, and a signed dated statement from the homeowner detailing their experience. I created a spreadsheet cross-referencing every fine, the alleged violation, and the actual text of the HOA bylaws. Over 70% of the fines Brenda had issued in the past year had no basis in the community's written rules. They were pure fabrications of her will. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was racketeering in miniature. 10 days after I sent my certified letter, a thin envelope arrived from the HOA. It wasn't the trove of documents I had requested. It was a single sheet of paper, a letter from Brenda herself. Mr. Henderson, it began, the tone dripping with condescension. The board has received your request. We find its scope to be burdensome and harassing. As you are currently not a member in good standing due to your violation of pool regulations, we are under no obligation to comply. Please remit payment of $50 for a new pool pass and sign the enclosed behavioral agreement, and we may reconsider your status. Further frivolous communications will result in fines for harassment of the board. She had no idea the gift she'd just given me. Refusing a legitimate request for records was a direct violation of state law. The claim that I was not a member in good standing was libelous, as my standing was contractually guaranteed. And the attempt to fine me for harassment was a laughable overreach of her authority. She had just provided me with Exhibit A of her malfeasance, bearing her own signature. I carefully slid the letter into a plastic sleeve and placed it in the front of my binder. The trap was now set. Her arrogance was the bait, and she had swallowed it whole. With her official written refusal in hand, I moved to the next phase of the operation. It was time to escalate beyond the neighborhood. I spent an afternoon drafting a new set of letters. These were not for Brenda. The first was to the State Attorney General's Office, Division of Consumer Protection. In it, I detailed a pattern of potentially fraudulent activity by an HOA board, citing the illegal fines, the threats of liens, and the refusal to provide records. I attached copies of the Miller's and Chen's documents, as well as Brenda's signed letter to me. The second letter was to the state's Department of Real Estate, which had oversight jurisdiction for homeowners associations. I laid out the same case, but framed it in terms of board misconduct and failure of fiduciary duty. I included the spreadsheet I'd created, showing the massive discrepancy between the fines levied and the actual bylaws. The third letter was the most important. It went to my old friend and former subordinate from the JAG Corps, Tom Abernathy, now a senior partner at a major law firm downtown. I enclosed a full copy of my binder, my original property deed with the utility easement, and a simple cover note. "Tom, I have a pro bono case for you. I think you'll enjoy it." Tom called me less than an hour after the courier delivered the package. I could hear the grin in his voice. "Colonel," he said, "it's been a while since I've seen such a beautifully documented case of a petty tyrant digging her own grave. What's our objective?" "Total surrender," I replied without hesitation. "I want her removed from the board. I want every illegal fine she ever levied refunded with interest. And I want a public apology issued to this community. And I want my access to that pool, Tom." "Consider it done," he said. "I'll draft the demand letter. We'll give her one last chance to capitulate before we file the suit and the injunctions. Let's see if she's smart enough to fold." I knew she wasn't. Her ego wouldn't allow it. The demand letter Tom drafted was a work of art. It was 12 pages long, printed on heavy legal letterhead. It cited state statutes, case law precedents, and the HOA's own governing documents. It methodically listed every single violation Brenda had committed, from the petty harassment of residents to the illegal denial of records. It detailed the potential for both civil and criminal liability. It demanded her immediate resignation from the board, a full independent audit of the HOA's finances, and the immediate cessation of all enforcement actions. It gave her 10 business days to comply. We sent it via courier to her house, addressed to her as President, the Willows HOA. We also sent copies to the other 4 members of the board at their homes. This was a critical step. Brenda had likely been keeping them in the dark, running the board as a one-woman show. I wanted to sever her from her support base, to make them realize the legal jeopardy she was putting them all in. The neighborhood was quiet for the next few days, the calm before the storm. Then, on the 8th day, a notice was posted on the community bulletin board. "Emergency Community Meeting," it read in a large aggressive font. "All residents are required to attend. We will be discussing recent threats to our community's integrity and a proposed special assessment to fund our legal defense against a disruptive resident." She was not only refusing to surrender, she was doubling down. She was trying to frame me as the enemy and get the other residents to pay for her legal battle against me. It was a bold, desperate, and incredibly stupid move. She was bringing the entire community into the kill zone she had created for herself. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday at the community clubhouse. This was it, the final battlefield. I spent the intervening time preparing. I met again with the families who had provided statements, reassuring them and confirming they would attend the meeting. I made 20 copies of Tom's demand letter and the most damning pieces of evidence from my binder. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. More residents than had ever attended a meeting before were crammed into the small room, drawn by the scent of controversy. Brenda and the other 4 board members sat at a long table at the front. She looked flushed and self-important, basking in the attention. The other board members looked distinctly uncomfortable. My letters had clearly had an effect on them. Brenda banged a cheap gavel on the table. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, our wonderful community has recently come under attack by an individual who refuses to follow our rules and wishes to destroy the harmony we have all worked so hard to build. Her eyes locked on me, standing in the back of the room. A murmur went through the crowd. "This individual," she continued, her voice rising with theatrical indignation, "has made baseless accusations and threatened our association with frivolous lawsuits. In order to defend our property values and our way of life, the board is proposing a one-time special assessment of $500 per household to retain legal counsel." The room erupted. People were shouting, angry at the sudden demand for money. Brenda banged the gavel again. "It is a necessary expense to protect us." This was my moment. I calmly walked to the front of the room. "That won't be necessary," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. "Mr. Henderson, you are out of order," Brenda shrieked. "No," I said, turning to face the assembled homeowners. "For the first time in a long time, things are about to be put in order." I looked at the other board members. "Have you all had a chance to review the letter my attorney sent you? The one that details the 27 specific violations of state law and our own bylaws committed by your president?" Two of them shifted uncomfortably and wouldn't meet my gaze. The other two looked pale. "I have copies for everyone," I said, holding up the stack I'd prepared. "I encourage you to read it. You'll find, for instance, that Mrs. Miller was fined hundreds of dollars for a landscaping violation that doesn't exist in our bylaws. You'll find Mr. Chen was threatened with legal action for a basketball hoop, in clear violation of his property rights. You'll find that your president has, for years, been using your money to wage personal vendettas." I began passing out the packets. People eagerly took them, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension as they read. Brenda's face had gone from crimson to a blotchy purple. "Lies! These are all lies from a disgruntled resident." "Are they?" I asked calmly. "Is your signature on this letter, where you illegally denied my request for financial records, a lie?" I held up the letter for all to see. "Is it a lie that the State Attorney General's office is currently reviewing a formal complaint against you for this very behavior?" A gasp went through the room. "And is it a lie?" I continued, my voice dropping slightly, building to the final blow, "that you are proposing to use this community's money to defend you from the consequences of your own illegal actions?" The tide of the room had turned completely. Faces that had been confused were now angry, and their anger was directed squarely at the woman at the front table. Her supporters, the few she had, were silent, sinking into their chairs. The other board members looked like they wanted to be anywhere else on earth. This is an outrage," Brenda stammered, her authority evaporating before her eyes. "You have no right." "Actually," I said, turning my full attention to her, "I have every right. And that brings me to my final point. You see, you tried to lock me out of the community pool. You based this on the flimsy pretext of a pool pass. What you failed to understand, in your exhaustive study of the bylaws, is the hierarchy of legal documents. A contract, for instance, supersedes any bylaw an HOA can invent. I held up a copy of my property deed. This is the deed to my land. It includes a utility easement, an easement that allows this community to exist. You seem to have forgotten something very, very important, Brenda." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Every drop of water in this subdivision, the water in your pipes, the water that irrigates these lawns, the water that fills that pool you hold so dear, comes from a well. And that well is on my property. I own it. And I own the water rights. The shock in the room was palpable. It was a leaden, heavy silence. Brenda's jaw was slack, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked like a fish gasping for air. According to our legally binding agreement, your right to use that water is contingent on my unrestricted access to all community amenities. When you locked me out of the pool, you violated that contract. You broke the deal. I paused, letting the full weight of the implication land. So, as of this moment, I am exercising my legal right to terminate your utility service for breach of contract. Effective immediately, the water is being turned off. Panic erupted. Brenda was speechless. Her face, which had been purple, was now draining of all color, leaving a pasty, grayish white. "You can't do that," one of the board members finally squeaked. "I can," I said, my voice cold as steel. "And I have. Before I came here tonight, I had a licensed contractor install a master shutoff valve at the wellhead. My son-in-law, who is waiting for my call, turned it off 10 minutes ago. I suggest none of you try to flush your toilets when you get home." Just then, the double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. Two men in crisp suits walked in, followed by two uniformed county sheriff's deputies. One of the men held up a badge. "Brenda Miller?" he asked, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm Agent Davis from the State Attorney General's office. We have a warrant to seize all financial records of the Willows HOA. We also have a few questions for you." Brenda's entire world collapsed in that instant. The last vestiges of her power, her authority, her self-importance shattered into a million pieces. The deputies stepped forward as Agent Davis began to speak. It was a beautiful, systematic demolition. The aftermath was as swift as it was decisive. The arrival of the investigators, perfectly timed, was the final crushing blow. It transformed the situation from a neighborhood dispute into a formal criminal investigation. The deputies weren't there for show. They immediately secured the HOA office, which was adjacent to the clubhouse, and began boxing up every file, every computer, every receipt. Brenda, looking small and utterly defeated, was escorted into that office for questioning. The public humiliation was total. Every resident she had ever terrorized was there to witness her fall from grace. The emergency meeting dissolved into a chaotic buzz of conversations. People who had been afraid to speak to each other for years were now clustered in small groups, sharing their own stories of Brenda's tyranny. Their faces a mixture of relief and vindicated anger. I saw George Miller clapping Mr. Chen on the back. Eileen was crying, but this time they were tears of joy. They approached me, one by one, shaking my hand, thanking me. I simply nodded. This wasn't a victory I celebrated with cheers. It was the quiet satisfaction of a necessary job well done. Order restored. I made a phone call. A few minutes later, the water pressure in the clubhouse kitchen sink, which someone had experimentally turned on, returned with a gurgle. A small cheer went up. It was a symbolic act. The tyrant was deposed, and the lifeblood of the community was flowing once more. The legal fallout for Brenda was catastrophic. The Attorney General's investigation uncovered years of financial abuse. She had been using the HOA's debit card for personal expenses, groceries, salon appointments, clothing, and disguising them as community maintenance. She had a slush fund of illegally collected fines that she used as her personal petty cash. She was formally charged with multiple counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The evidence, much of which I had initially gathered, was overwhelming. She pleaded guilty to avoid a trial and was sentenced to 18 months in state prison, 5 years of probation, and was ordered to pay full restitution of over $75,000. To satisfy the judgment, a lien was placed on her house, the very weapon she had wielded against others, and it was eventually sold at auction. The HOA itself was placed into temporary receivership by the state. The existing board members all resigned in disgrace, eager to avoid any further legal entanglement. A forensic accountant was brought in to clean up the books. Every fine that had been levied without proper cause during Brenda's reign was identified and refunded, with interest, to the residents. The Millers received a check for over $800. The Chens got their $200 back. It was more than just money. It was a restoration of justice. Over the next few months, I worked with the court-appointed receiver and a committee of homeowners to completely rewrite the HOA's bylaws. We stripped out all the vague, subjective language that Brenda had exploited. We established clear, transparent procedures for everything from landscaping approvals to financial audits. We put in term limits for board members and created an independent oversight committee. We built a system designed to serve the community, not to empower a dictator. A new board was elected. George Miller, emboldened by the victory, was unanimously voted in as the new president. His first act was to formally abolish the rule against unapproved flora. Within a week, his front yard was a riot of colorful roses, more beautiful than ever before. The Chen's son got a brand-new, top-of-the-line basketball hoop, and the sound of him practicing in the afternoon became a cheerful, welcome fixture in the neighborhood. The community began to heal. Block parties, which had been non-existent under Brenda's rule, became a monthly occurrence. Neighbors were talking to each other again. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and suspicion was replaced by a genuine sense of community. The changes were small, but profound. It felt like a town liberated after a long occupation. As for me, my life returned to its quiet rhythm. My exemption from HOA rules and dues was formally and publicly reaffirmed in the new bylaws, not that it was ever in legal doubt. But I chose to pay the dues anyway. I wasn't just the owner of the water source, I was a member of the community. The following summer, my granddaughter came to visit again. On a bright, sunny Tuesday, we walked down to the pool. It was crowded with families. Kids were laughing and splashing. The air was filled with the sounds of a happy, thriving neighborhood. My granddaughter, holding a brand-new, even more garish rainbow-colored unicorn floaty, jumped into the water with a squeal of delight. I sat in a lounge chair, watching her play. George Miller walked over, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to me. "It's good to see, isn't it, Colonel?" he said, gesturing at the joyful scene. "It is, George," I replied, taking a sip. "It's very good." We sat in comfortable silence for a while. I thought about the long campaign, the methodical gathering of facts, the slow, tightening siege that had brought down a petty tyrant. Justice isn't always a thunderous lightning bolt from above. Sometimes it's a quiet, patient process of documentation. Sometimes it's a certified letter. Sometimes it's the simple, unassailable truth written on a property deed from 100 years ago. Brenda's fundamental error was one common to all bullies. She mistook quietness for weakness. She assumed a man who wanted to be left alone was a man who could be pushed around. She had no concept of strategic patience, of a controlled fury that burns cold and bright. She thought she was fighting over a pink flamingo in a swimming pool. She never understood, not until the very end, that she was fighting for her entire world against a man who had already secured the high ground before the first shot was even fired. She had chosen to make my life difficult, and in doing so, she had given me a mission. And I am a man who always completes the mission. My granddaughter paddled over to the side of the pool, her face beaming. "Grandpa, come in. The water's perfect." I smiled, putting my glass down. I looked at the clean, clear water sparkling in the sun, the very water that had been the instrument of a tyrant's downfall and a community's liberation. "I'm coming," I said, and I walked to the edge of the pool, a place I had every right to be, and dove in.